The crimson sun hung low over the Montana Territory, as Sarah Thornton watched in horror when the swollen river snatched away the willow basket cradling her infant son. Her desperate screams pierced the afternoon air, but the churning waters showed no mercy, carrying her most precious possession downstream with frightening speed. Montana Territory. 1873, Sarah Thornton had never imagined her life would come to this moment. 23 years old, widowed for 6 months, and now watching helplessly as the river threatened to take the only family she had left. She had traveled west from Philadelphia after her husband, Thomas, died of consumption, hoping to start anew on the small plot of land he'd purchased before their marriage. The promise of a fresh beginning had sustained her through the grueling journey, even as she carried their unborn child, James. She screamed, her voice breaking as she ran along the riverbank, her skirts heavy with mud and water. Her son was only 4 months old, wrapped in a handmade basket she'd woven herself during the long winter evenings. She'd placed him there for just a moment while washing clothes at the river's edge, never expecting the bank to give way beneath the basket when the water suddenly surged. Sarah stumbled on the uneven ground, falling to her knees as the basket bobbed farther away. Her chest heaved with sobs as she scrambled back to her feet, ignoring the tear in her already worn dress. The basket was nearly out of sight now, carried around a bend in the river that cut through her small homestead. "Please, God," she prayed, her voice barely audible above the rushing water. "Please don't take him too." She ran until her lungs burned, following the river's curve while keeping her eyes fixed on the distant speck that was her baby's basket. The land sloped downward, and Sarah lost her footing, tumbling down the embankment. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed, but she pushed herself upright, limping forward with determination. When she rounded the next bend, her heart stopped. The basket was nowhere in sight. The river widened here, flowing faster toward a series of small rapids. Sarah's knees buckled as a wail of despair tore from her throat. "No, no, no," she repeated, wading into the shallows despite the current's pull. "James, my baby." She was so consumed by her grief that she didn't notice the rider approaching from downstream until his horse's hooves splashed through the water nearby. Sarah turned, blinking through her tears at the tall figure dismounting from a chestnut mare. "Madam," the stranger called, his voice deep and steady. "Are you looking for this?" In his arms was her willow basket, water dripping from its sides. Sarah could hardly believe her eyes, staring in disbelief as the man approached, his expression serious beneath the brim of his worn leather hat. "He's still breathing," the man said, his voice gentler now as he came closer. "But he's cold. We need to warm him quickly." Sarah's world narrowed to those 3 words, "He's still breathing." She rushed forward, nearly collapsing with relief as she reached for her son. The stranger carefully transferred the basket to her trembling arms, and Sarah peered inside to find James's tiny face flushed, but his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Oh, thank you," she sobbed, clutching the basket to her chest. "Thank you." The man nodded, his features coming into focus as Sarah's tears cleared. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 29, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the Montana sky. His clothes were dusty from the trail-worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. A cowboy by the look of him, with a revolver strapped to his hip and a lariat coiled at his saddle. "Name's Daniel Evans," he said, reaching out to steady her when she swayed. "We need to get you both somewhere warm and dry." "Your place nearby," Sarah nodded, unable to form words through her overwhelming relief. Her ankle throbbed with each step, but she refused to let go of James. "You're hurt," Daniel observed, his gaze dropping to her muddy hem where bloodstains were beginning to show. Without waiting for permission, he swept Sarah and the basket into his arms and carried them to his horse. "Hold tight to him," he instructed as he helped her into the saddle. Sarah clutched James to her chest with one arm while gripping the saddle horn with the other. Daniel swung up behind her with surprising grace for such a tall man, reaching around her to take the reins. "Which way?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "North," Sarah managed, her voice still unsteady. "About a quarter-mile upstream." As they rode, Sarah's mind raced with questions. How had this stranger happened upon her son? How had he managed to rescue the basket from the rushing water? But more pressing was her concern for James, who had begun to whimper softly, the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. Daniel guided the horse with confident hands, keeping his arms around Sarah to ensure she and the baby remained secure. Despite her distress, she couldn't help noticing the strength in those arms, the gentle way he handled them both. "There," Sarah pointed as her small cabin came into view. It wasn't much, a one-room structure built by Thomas before his illness had overwhelmed him. She'd finished it herself after arriving, determined to make it a home for her and her soon-to-be-born child. Daniel dismounted first, then reached up to help Sarah down. She winced as her injured ankle took her weight, but her focus remained entirely on James. "Let me," Daniel said, once again lifting her into his arms before she could protest. He carried them both to the cabin door, which Sarah had left unlatched in her haste to chase after the basket. Inside, Daniel set her gently on the small bed in the corner. "Fire's nearly out," he observed, moving to the stone hearth where embers still glowed. "I'll build it up. Get those wet things off the little one." Sarah carefully unwrapped James from his sodden blankets. His skin was cool to the touch, but his cries were growing stronger, a promising sign. She changed him into dry clothes from the small chest beside the bed, murmuring soothing words as she worked. Daniel had the fire blazing in no time, moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to life in the wilderness. He hung a kettle of water over the flames, then turned to Sarah with concern in his eyes. "How is he?" he asked, approaching the bed where Sarah cradled James against her chest. "Warming up," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Evans." "If you hadn't been there." She couldn't complete the thought, the alternative too terrible to voice. "Daniel," he corrected gently, "and there's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." Sarah shook her head. Not everyone would have risked the rapids to save a stranger's child. She looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. There was kindness in his weathered face and something else, a sadness behind his eyes that spoke of his own losses. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, kneeling to examine her injured ankle with surprisingly gentle hands. "Sarah Thornton," she answered, wincing as he carefully removed her mud-caked boot. "And this is James." "You're alone out here, Mrs. Thornton?" His question was practical, not prying, as he inspected the swollen flesh of her ankle. "Yes," Sarah replied simply. "My husband passed 6 months ago." "Before James was born." Daniel nodded, his expression softening with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss." He rose and retrieved a clean cloth from near the wash basin. After dipping it in cool water, he returned to wrap it around her ankle. "It's not broken, but you'll need to stay off it for a few days." "I can't afford to rest," Sarah protested. "I have chores, the garden needs tending, I can help," Daniel interrupted. When Sarah began to shake her head, he added, "Just until you're back on your feet." "I was headed to Helena anyway, but I'm in no particular hurry." Sarah wanted to refuse. She'd grown accustomed to handling everything herself, determined to prove that she could survive on her own in this harsh territory. But James squirmed against her chest, his little face scrunched with hunger, reminding her that she wasn't truly alone and that she had responsibilities beyond her pride. "I'd be grateful for the help," she conceded, "but I can pay you only in meals. Money is scarce." Daniel's smile transformed his face, erasing years of hardship in an instant. "Meals would be more than fair. Trail food gets mighty tiresome." While Sarah nursed James, Daniel excused himself to tend to his horse and bring in his saddlebags. By the time he returned, she had settled James in his cradle, a small wooden box Thomas had fashioned before falling ill, and was attempting to prepare a simple meal despite her throbbing ankle. "Sit," Daniel ordered, guiding her back to the chair by the fire. "You need to keep that foot elevated." Sarah reluctantly obeyed, watching as Daniel moved around her small cabin with unexpected domestic competence. He located her meager supplies and soon had a pot of beans simmering over the fire, enriched with salt pork from his own provisions. As they shared the simple meal, Sarah's curiosity finally overcame her exhaustion. "How did you find him? The basket, I mean." Daniel set down his tin cup, his expression serious. "I was riding along the river when I saw something unusual floating ahead. Thought it might be debris at first. Then I heard what sounded like a baby's cry." He shook his head, still seeming amazed. "I rode ahead, found a bend where the current slowed enough that the basket had caught against some branches. Got there just as it was about to sink." Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the scene, how close she'd come to losing everything. "You're a godsend, Daniel Evans," she whispered. "Just a man in the right place at the right time," he replied. "Nothing more." But Sarah knew better. In the Montana Territory of 1873, such coincidences were rare enough to feel like divine intervention. That night, Daniel insisted on sleeping on the floor near the hearth, refusing Sarah's offer to take that spot herself. As she drifted off to sleep with James safely beside her, Sarah wondered about the cowboy who had saved her son's life. There was more to his story than he'd shared, she was certain. But for now, she was simply grateful for his presence. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin's single window. Sarah awoke to find Daniel already gone, though the fire had been freshly stoked. She checked on James, who slept peacefully in his cradle, then hobbled to the door to look outside. Daniel stood by the small corral, where not only his chestnut mare but also Sarah's own stubborn mule now grazed on fresh hay. He was repairing a broken fence post, his movements methodical and practiced. Sarah watched him for a moment, struck by how quickly he had assessed what needed doing without being asked. Men like that were rare, especially out here where survival often hardened hearts against kindness. James began to fuss, drawing Sarah back inside. As she tended to her son, she found herself wondering how long Daniel might stay. A day or two, he'd suggested, but something told her he wasn't a man who rushed his decisions. Over the next 3 days, Sarah's ankle improved steadily, though Daniel refused to let her do any strenuous work. He repaired the leaking roof, reinforced the corral fence, and even managed to hunt a young deer, providing them with fresh meat. In the evenings, they sat by the fire while Sarah mended clothes and Daniel carved a small wooden horse for James, who watched the stranger with increasingly curious eyes. On the 4th morning, Sarah awoke to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his back to her as he gazed out at the dawn. His posture spoke of a decision made, and Sarah felt an unexpected pang in her chest. "You're leaving," she said softly, causing him to turn. "Thought I might," he admitted, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "Your ankle's healing well, and I should get on to Helena before winter sets in." Sarah nodded, ignoring the disappointment that settled in her stomach. "Of course. You've done more than enough already." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hat in his hands. "I could stay another day or two," he offered. "There's still that vegetable patch needs fencing to keep the rabbits out." Sarah smiled, recognizing his words for what they were, an excuse to remain a little longer. "That would be helpful," she agreed, perhaps too quickly. Relief flickered across Daniel's face. "Good. That's good." As the days stretched into a week and then two, neither of them mentioned his departure again. A routine developed naturally between them, Daniel handling the heavier outdoor work while Sarah managed the household and garden with James always close by. In the evenings, they shared stories of their lives before Montana. Sarah learned that Daniel had been a ranch hand in Texas before the war, then a cavalry scout during the conflict. After Appomattox, he drifted westward, working cattle drives and taking odd jobs wherever he could find them. He spoke little of family, though Sarah gathered he had none left to speak of. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her brief courtship with Thomas, and their dream of building a life in the West. She spoke of Thomas with respect and fondness, though she was surprised to discover the sharp edge of her grief had somehow softened without her noticing. "He would have been a good father," she said one evening as they watched James attempt to roll over on a blanket spread before the fire. "He was so excited about the baby." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on James's determined efforts. "He'd be proud of you both," he said quietly. "Not many women could manage what you have, Sarah." The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. It was the first time he'd used it without the formal Mrs. Thornton, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. That night, after James had fallen asleep and Daniel had retreated to his bedroll by the hearth, Sarah lay awake, confronting feelings she hadn't expected to face again so soon. She was a widow with a young child, struggling to survive on the frontier. There was no room in her life for the fluttering in her chest whenever Daniel smiled at her, or the way her skin tingled when their hands occasionally brushed while working together. Yet those feelings persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. October brought the first frost, painting the landscape in crystalline white each morning. Daniel had been with them for nearly a month, his presence so natural that Sarah could hardly remember what life had been like before he arrived. James, now 5 months old, had taken to watching Daniel's every move with fascinated eyes, cooing delightedly whenever the cowboy spoke to him. "He likes you," Sarah observed one afternoon as Daniel bounced James gently on his knee, the baby's laughter filling the cabin with joy. "Smart kid," Daniel replied with a wink that made Sarah's cheeks warm. "Knows I'm his biggest admirer, don't you, partner?" He lifted James above his head, eliciting more giggles. Sarah watched them together, her heart full to bursting. In the weeks since the river incident, Daniel had shown himself to be not just a capable hand around the homestead, but a man of integrity and gentle strength. He treated her with respect that never felt condescending, valued her opinions about the property, and demonstrated remarkable patience with James. It was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine her life without him. That evening, as they sat side by side on the small porch Daniel had built, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah gathered her courage. "Winter will be here soon," she said softly. "Helena will be snowbound before long." Daniel nodded, his profile illuminated by the fading light. "Been thinking the same thing myself." "What are your plans?" Sarah asked, her heart beating painfully against her ribs. "For the winter, I mean." Daniel turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the twilight. "Depends," he said carefully, "on whether I'd be welcome to stay here." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You'd want to stay all winter, not just the winter," Daniel replied, his voice low and earnest. Sarah, I know it hasn't been that long, and I know you're still grieving Thomas. I don't want to push where I'm not wanted, but these past weeks," he trailed off, searching for words, "have been the happiest I can remember," Sarah finished for him, surprising herself with her honesty. Daniel's expression softened. "For me as well." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "I never expected to find anything like this when I pulled that basket from the river. Never thought I'd care for anyone again, after all I've seen and lost." Sarah interlaced her fingers with his, drawing strength from the connection. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that James would be enough." "And is he?" Daniel asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Enough?" Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the future she hadn't dared hope for reflected there. "He is everything to me," she said softly, "but I'm beginning to think there might be room in our lives for someone else too." Daniel's smile was radiant in the fading light. "I'd like to be that someone, Sarah, if you'll have me." Instead of answering with words, Sarah leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but full of promise, a beginning rather than an ending. When she pulled back, Daniel's expression was one of wonder. "I'll take that as a yes," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "It's a yes," Sarah confirmed, smiling through sudden tears. "For as long as you want to stay." "That would be forever then," Daniel replied, drawing her closer as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The winter of 1873 proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with blizzards that howled through the valley and snowdrifts taller than a man. But inside the small cabin, warmth prevailed. Daniel had reinforced the walls with additional logs, built sturdy shutters for the windows, and laid in a supply of firewood that reached halfway up the outside wall. They had smoked meat hanging from the rafters, preserves Sarah had put up during the fall, and enough flour and beans to last until spring. More precious than these provisions was the growing bond between them. Daniel proved to be as gentle a suitor as he was a capable partner, never pressuring Sarah for more than she was ready to give. They shared long conversations by firelight after James was asleep, exchanged tender kisses that gradually grew more passionate, and built a foundation of trust and mutual respect. By Christmas, marked by a small pine tree Daniel cut and decorated with paper stars, Sarah, crafted from old letters, they had become a family in all but name. James, now 7 months old and attempting to crawl, reached for Daniel as readily as he did for Sarah, babbling happily whenever the cowboy entered the room. On Christmas morning, after James had been thoroughly delighted by the wooden animals Daniel had carved for him, Sarah presented Daniel with a new shirt she'd sewn in secret, using fabric traded from a passing peddler. "It's beautiful," Daniel said, running his fingers over the careful stitching. "But I didn't expect anything. You've given us so much," Sarah replied. "I wanted you to have something made just for you." Daniel's eyes grew suspiciously bright. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "I have something for you too," he said, suddenly appearing nervous. Sarah unwrapped the cloth to find a simple silver band, a ring fashioned from what appeared to be a melted-down coin. The craftsmanship was rudimentary but beautiful in its sincerity. "It's not much," Daniel said quickly. "Not what you deserve, but I wanted you to have it to know my intentions. When the spring comes and the preacher makes his circuit, I'd like to make this official, if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." Sarah stared at the ring, tears blurring her vision. Then she looked up at the man who had saved not just her son's life but her own heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Daniel Evans, I will marry you." The kiss they shared sealed a promise that had begun the moment he'd returned her son to her arms. saying those three miraculous words. "He's still breathing." Spring arrived late that year, the snow reluctantly retreating from the valley as April turned to May. The preacher arrived with the first wildflowers, his circuit taking him through the scattered homesteads of the territory. Sarah had never been happier to hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats as the elderly Reverend Johnson made his way to their cabin. The wedding was simple but meaningful, held outside the cabin with the newly green mountains as their witness. Sarah wore her best dress, freshly laundered and adorned with wildflowers Daniel had gathered that morning. James, now 10 months old and pulling himself up on furniture, watched the proceedings from a quilt spread on the new spring grass, occasionally clapping his hands as if approving of the union. "Do you, Daniel Evans, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Johnson asked, his weathered face solemn beneath his white beard. "I do," Daniel replied, his voice steady as he squeezed Sarah's hands in his. "And do you, Sarah Thornton, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sarah looked up at Daniel, the man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. "I do," she said, her heart full to bursting. "Then by the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher smiled kindly. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Evans." Daniel leaned down to capture Sarah's lips in a tender kiss, one that promised a lifetime of love and commitment. When they parted, both were smiling through tears of joy. "Mrs. Evans," Daniel whispered, testing the sound of her new name. "I like the sound of that," Sarah replied, reaching up to touch his face with wonder. How far they had come from that terrible day by the river, how much they had overcome together. After a simple wedding supper, during which Reverend Johnson blessed their union once more before continuing on his circuit, Sarah and Daniel stood together on the porch of their cabin. James had fallen asleep, exhausted by the excitement of the day, leaving the newlyweds a rare moment alone. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Sarah admitted, leaning against Daniel's solid chest as they watched the sun setting behind the mountains. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over." Daniel's arms tightened around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "I know what you mean. After the war, after everything I saw and did, I didn't think I deserved happiness." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "You deserve every happiness, Daniel Evans. You're a good man with a kind heart." "You and James are all the happiness I need," he replied, kissing her forehead. "My family." That night, as husband and wife, they consummated their marriage with tender passion that left them both breathless and more deeply connected than ever before. As Sarah drifted off to sleep in Daniel's arms, she reflected on the journey that had brought them together, the tragedy and fear that had opened the door to unexpected joy. Summer passed in a blur of hard work and quiet contentment. The small homestead flourished under their combined efforts. Daniel expanded the garden and built a proper barn, while Sarah preserved the bounty of their harvest for the coming winter. James grew stronger each day, taking his first tentative steps in August and babbling increasingly coherent sounds that sometimes resembled words. By September, as the aspen leaves turned golden on the mountainsides, Sarah was certain of what she'd suspected for weeks. One evening, after James had been settled in his crib now expanded by Daniel's skilled hands to accommodate his growing body, she took her husband's hand and led him to the porch. "I have news," she said, unable to contain her smile. "We're going to have a baby." Daniel stared at her for a moment, then let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way to Helena. He lifted Sarah off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her gently back down. "A baby," he repeated, his hands coming to rest reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Due in March, I think," Sarah confirmed, covering his hands with her own. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," Daniel answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, you and James already gave me more than I ever dreamed possible, and now this." He shook his head, overcome. "I'm the luckiest man in the Montana Territory." That winter was milder than the previous one, but Sarah and Daniel took no chances. The cabin was well provisioned, the livestock secured in the new barn, and extra precautions taken for Sarah's pregnancy. Daniel became even more protective, insisting on handling the more strenuous chores despite Sarah's protests that she wasn't an invalid. "Humor me," he'd say with that smile she couldn't resist. "Let me take care of you for a change." As Christmas approached again, marking a year since Daniel's proposal, they celebrated with greater festivity. James, now 14 months old and walking with increasing confidence, delighted in the decorations and the small gifts they'd prepared. Sarah had fashioned a rag doll for him, while Daniel had built a tiny rocking chair sized perfectly for a toddler. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside their window, Daniel presented Sarah with another gift, a journal bound in soft leather. "For our family's story," he explained as she ran her fingers over the blank pages, "so our children will know where they came from." Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I'll start tonight," she promised, already knowing the first words she would write. The river took her baby basket downstream. The cowboy brought it back saying, "He's still breathing." Their daughter, Emily Rose Evans, arrived on a clear March morning in 1874, entering the world with a lusty cry that announced her strong spirit from the first breath. She had her father's blue eyes and a tuft of dark hair that Sarah was certain came from her side of the family. James, now 18 months old, regarded his baby sister with solemn curiosity, reaching out to touch her tiny fingers with surprising gentleness. "Baby," he said clearly, one of the few words in his growing vocabulary. "That's right," Sarah confirmed, her heart overflowing with love for both her children. "Your baby sister." Daniel seemed incapable of taking his eyes off his daughter, standing guard over Sarah and Emily with the same protective instinct he'd shown when he'd first pulled James from the river. When the midwife from the nearest settlement finally left them alone, he sat beside Sarah on the bed, cradling Emily in arms that seemed impossibly large compared to her tiny form. "She's perfect," he whispered, awestruck. "Just like her mother." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, exhausted but deeply content. "We've been blessed, Daniel, more than I ever thought possible." As spring transformed into summer and summer gave way to fall, the Evans family thrived in their little corner of the Montana Territory. The homestead expanded with a second room added to the cabin, and new fencing enclosing larger gardens. Word of Daniel's skills with horses spread through the area, bringing occasional work-breaking and training mounts for neighboring ranches and passing traders. By 1876, their family had grown again with the birth of William Thomas Evans, named for both Daniel's father and Sarah's first husband, a gesture of respect for the man whose dream had brought Sarah west. The cabin expanded once more, now a proper house with 3 rooms and a sturdy stone fireplace. Life on the frontier remained challenging, with harsh winters and the constant work required to sustain a family on the edge of civilization. But Sarah and Daniel faced each obstacle together, their love deepening with each passing season. On the 5th anniversary of the day, Daniel had pulled James's basket from the river. They stood together on the porch of their home, watching their 3 children play in the yard. James, now 5 and full of questions about everything, was showing his 3-year-old sister how to build a fort from sticks while baby William toddled after them on unsteady legs. You ever think about that day? Sarah asked, leaning against her husband's solid frame. How different things might have been if you hadn't been riding along that river at that exact moment. Daniel's arm tightened around her waist. I try not to think about the might-have-beens, he admitted, but I do thank God every day that I was there. Sarah turned to face him, studying the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. Time had added a few more lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but he was still the same man who had returned her son to her arms that desperate day. I thought I was being punished, she confessed. When the river took James, I thought it was God's judgment for something I'd done wrong. I couldn't imagine then that it was actually bringing me the greatest blessing of my life. Daniel cupped her face in his calloused hands. Some might call it fate, he said softly. I call it providence. I was lost before I found you and James, Sarah, drifting without purpose. You gave me a reason to stop running to build something lasting. And you gave us safety, Sarah replied. A family, love I never thought I'd feel again. Their kiss was interrupted by James's excited shout as he completed his stick fort, calling for their approval. Hand in hand, Sarah and Daniel walked down from the porch to join their children, the family that had begun with a river's threat and a cowboy's courage. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah opened the leather journal Daniel had given her years before. The pages were now half filled with their family's story births and milestones, challenges overcome, moments of joy preserved in ink. She dipped her pen and added another entry. Today marks 5 years since Daniel came into our lives. 5 years since the river nearly took everything from me, only to give me more than I could have imagined. Our home is full of laughter and love. The children grow stronger and more curious each day. And my heart remains as full as it was the moment Daniel stood before me, holding my baby, saying those words I'll never forget. He's still breathing. She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside the small willow basket, preserved now as a reminder of both the day they'd almost lost everything and the day their family truly began. Outside, the Montana stars shone brilliantly over the land they'd made their own, a future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western sky.